It's time to go inside the Birds in Focus podcast, a Philly Sports Network show with your host, Nick Faria.
And welcome to another episode 2 of the Birds in Focus podcast, where the Birds, the Philadelphia Eagles, are the focus, as well as the top storylines across the NFL. Hi, everybody. I'm Nick Faria. I have a great show planned for you today. We've got a great interview coming up with John McMullen, Eagles insider for 97.3 ESPN in South Jersey. And today's episode 2 of the Birds in Focus podcast, titled Skill Position Woes, because for Philadelphia, if there's one position of need that still needs to be filled, it's at the skill position, the wide receiver and cornerback position. And of course, with the NFL, a lot of the talk, a lot of problems going on right now are at the skill positions. Again, I'm Nick Faria. Thank you so much for joining me inside the Birds in Focus podcast, episode number 2 today. We do have a lot to get to. I already teased our interview with John McMullen of ESPN, but I think when you look at this past week, and I always like to air our show on Sunday, give a chance for everyone to breathe and relax, and on Sunday morning you can listen in and think and talk about football for the first time, if you will, and get your distraction from what's going on outside in the real world with coronavirus and everything else going on. But in the end, and I think the biggest storylines this week really pertain to the skill positions. And I'm not talking about quarterback. Yes, we can talk about Cam Newton no longer being the face of the Carolina Panthers franchise anymore. He's been released and will be a free agent. Obviously something to look at later on, particularly around draft night. But no, I want to talk about a different skill position, and that's the skill position of running back. Now, there were 2 moves this past week that really raised eyebrows across the league. And not so much that the moves were made, but the status of how they were made is what made them so interesting. And of course, the 2 moves that I'm talking about, Melvin Gordon signing a 2-year deal with the Denver Broncos, and Todd Gurley, at one point a 2-time All-Pro, only 25 years of age, released by the team that drafted him, the Los Angeles Rams, and signs a 1-year, $6 million deal with the Atlanta Falcons. And when I have this opening monologue for our Birds in Focus podcast here, I always want to talk about one main focus. And what's the one main national focus that NFL fans should be talking about? And I think this week it should be the running back position, mostly because we're seeing the value of the running back go from one of the most important positions on the football field back in the 1980s and 90s, and even arguably the 2000s, because there were so many running backs who could run and catch, to now the position is all but a waste. Why spend money on a running back when you can spend money on your quarterback, your corner, or your offense and defensive line? It doesn't make sense. And yet, with the Los Angeles Rams, and I always say this with teams needing a running back, really trying to be patient with taking a running back in the first round. You look at what the Dallas Cowboys did with Ezekiel Elliott. They drafted Elliott, and he's the centerpiece of their offense. And Cowboy fans everywhere will argue with me that Dak Prescott's their leader. He's the face of the franchise. This offense does not run through Dak Prescott. And it's the same with the Los Angeles Rams. Todd Gurley was drafted number 10 overall in the draft. And yet here we are just a few years ago where he was a all-pro running back, a 2-time all-pro running back, 25 years old, was seemingly thought of as the best back, most complete back in all of football, and now he's been cut. Before, back in, I believe it was 2018, he signed a 4-year, $60 million deal, $45 million guaranteed money. That was his contract for the highest paid running back in the NFL and the highest paid running back in NFL history to that point. Ezekiel Elliott now tops that. But I want to talk about Todd Gurley here because what I don't understand and what I always say as the devaluation of the running back position, with Todd Gurley, this dude had injury problems. And he had injury problems back when he was at Georgia. He had knee surgery. It was a big problem when he was coming into the NFL. It was why he dropped number 10 overall to the Rams. And now he's only 25 years old, people. A 25-year-old running back is thought of seeing as on his last legs, because last season, after 2 All-Pro seasons, was pretty bad. Only 200 total carries, 3.8 yards a carry, and the Rams had to eat $20 million in dead cap just to be able to release him. Because teams everywhere, and you can argue that teams throughout the league are saying, we're not going to pay a running back $10 to $15 million, and we're going to be okay with adding other pieces around instead of just having one main feature back. And I want to stress to everyone, look back on NFL history this past decade. You tell me where a number one feature back was on the roster and he led his team to a Super Bowl title. You can't name one. I think the only player really that can be said as a lead feature back was the number one back was the 2013 Marshawn Lynch Seattle Seahawks. And we all know they won the Super Bowl that year not because they were able to run the ball over 150 times a game. They were a good running team, but that team was based and predicated off of having the best modern defense in NFL history. That secondary was fantastic. That wasn't because of Marshawn Lynch. But then you look and you say, okay, what about the other championship teams? The Patriots won 3 Super Bowls this decade, all with different characters at running back. LeGarrette Blount was a main guy in Philadelphia and New England, but he was part of a running back by committee that allowed the team to get to where they need to be. And you look at a team like the Pittsburgh Steelers, who had Le'Veon Bell, one of the most complete backs we've ever seen in the NFL, and he's sitting there now with the New York Jets on a contract that was less than what Pittsburgh had originally offered him, and after he held out for a full season. The running back position is completely, I don't want to say obsolete, but the main feature back is obsolete because you only get 3 to 4 all-pro elite years out of him. The Emmitt Smiths don't exist anymore. The Barry Sanders don't exist anymore in the NFL because the tread on the tires, specifically in the passing game, plays a part in that. And with Todd Gurley right now, that was one of the worst contracts in the NFL currently. And the Rams had to let him go. And as I said before, they're now eating $20 million in salary. $20 million in salary for a running back. Think about that. $20 million. It's just not a good contract. It just was a terrible contract to give specifically for a guy that had injury problems. Todd Gurley was named an All-Pro in 2018, and he did not have a good end of the season run because C.J. Anderson came in and sort of helped him out along the way. You cannot, in the NFL now, have a running back get 300 carries plus 98 receptions and expect them to be around for more than 5 years. It doesn't happen. Now Todd Gurley is 25 years old, continues to have knee problems. He has chronic knee issues. And we're looking at him as a guy that's pretty much washed up at 25. Think about how crazy that is. The other running back I want to talk about is Melvin Gordon. Melvin Gordon, let me tell you, I thought Le'Veon Bell was incorrect in his assessment that he could sit out for a full year and he'd be at the top of his game and he could get the money that he was looking for as a running back / receiver. Because that's what running backs want. They want receiver money, but also carrying and touching the ball 3 times more than any top receiver. You look at Alvin Kamara, look at the touches he had last season compared to Michael Thomas. Look at the touches between, Ezekiel Elliott and Michael Thomas. It's not even close. But for Melvin Gordon, he sat out for a good portion of last season, hoping to get a bigger contract than what the LA Chargers gave him, which was reportedly around $10 million, according to Ian Rappaport. And Gordon sat out, did not really play well. Austin Eckler got his contract and a nice hefty contract extension. And what did Melvin Gordon get? Well, Melvin Gordon got a 2-year deal, 2-year extension, $16 million deal with the Denver Broncos. That is pennies compared to the $10 million that was originally given to him by the Chargers. So I want to stress, to running backs everywhere and to players everywhere who are trying to overvalue their impact on a roster. The NFL can easily be stated as the not-for-long league. And I think Colin Cowherd says it a lot, not-for-long league. And not-for-long league pertains solely to the running back position. And that really, you see it with Todd Gurley, now an Atlanta Falcon, and Melvin Gordon, now a Denver Bronco. Two running backs, two first-round picks, I might add, that were Pro Bowl players, all-pro players, very good, solid athletes that wanted more than they're worth. The teams gave it to them, and either one wasn't satisfied and got less than what he originally wanted, or one is now facing chronic knee problems at the age of 25 and is not going to be able to be the same type of player that he was back in his prime. Think about that, 25 years old. We have 5 All-Pros that have retired before the age of 30 in the last 5 years. Andrew Luck, Rob Gronkowski, Calvin Johnson. I would not be surprised if Todd Gurley is another player on that list because of the chronic knee problems that he has had. Again, inside the Birds in Focus podcast, I'm Nick Faria. Now coming on to the show, and I teased this earlier, is Eagles insider for 97.3 of ESPN in South Jersey, John McMullen. And John, thanks so much for joining me today on this beautiful day. We had this interview recorded on Thursday. We're airing it on Sunday. So first, I want to start off, let's talk about your experiences and how you started your career and how you got to be an Eagles insider for ESPN.
Well, I went to school for journalism. I went to Westchester University locally, but I went to the University of Minnesota for journalism. Graduated, so it's always been a goal of mine as far as covering sports. Enjoyed sports. I think everybody in this industry at some point was a fan, and you envision making it a career, the old sentiment that if you like something, you don't work a day in your life. So I think that is kind of everybody's path towards journalism, towards sports journalism. And it changes over the years as you get in. I've been doing this for over 20 years, so you have less of that fandom, and I think that has come. I've moved around the country a lot, and I think cover different sports, and I think the goal in today's sports world is always the NFL because it is by far and away number one. And then you talk about the Eagles as a whole. This is the largest media contingent in the NFL is Philadelphia, believe it or not. It's even far bigger than New York, the people that cover this team on a day-to-day basis. So it's very competitive. It's very difficult to get into. And I think that's the standard. I've been able, fortunately, to do it. I've covered Minnesota, Tampa, and then the Eagles. And in between, I worked for a company called the Sports Network, which was a national company, national wire service.
Gotcha.
Where I was first the NBA in charge of the NBA department, then in charge of the NFL department. So that's kind of how I've gotten to where I've gotten.
Well, John, I want to get started right away. Let's talk about the Philadelphia Eagles as a whole, particularly last season. Before the season started, they had Super Bowl aspirations. A lot of people picked them to be the contenders for the Lombardi Trophy, but as the season wore on, expectations sort of changed. They finished 9-7, won the NFC East, but still did not perform as well as fans would have hoped. How would you assess the 2019 Eagles?
Well, I think it depends on where you are, and I think you're right. I think early in the process, a lot of people projected them as a legitimate Super Bowl contender. In hindsight, they were not. One of the things about the NFL that I talk about all the time is it's a very fluid sport in the fact that guys get old quickly, and I think you saw it right up close in Philadelphia. I mean, people I use Pro Football Focus as the perfect example, as the grading website that everyone kind of cites these days. And before the season, they rated, this is kind of amazing, and they get ripped for it, but it's really not untrue. They rated Philadelphia to have the top wide receiving core in the entire NFL. And by the time it was over, you could argue they had the worst. And I would say they did have the worst. So it's kind of, what prism are you looking at it from? If you went preseason and the assumption that they were a Super Bowl contender, you're a disappointment. I've always said, and this happens every year in this league, you don't know who anybody is until about midway through the season. By midway through the season, I had a clear view that this team was not nearly as good as people had assumed. And from that standpoint, you talked about that stretch run. I've said pretty consistently on the air, in print, this is Doug Peterson's best coaching job last year, to do what he did to get that team to the playoffs with the Greg Wards, the Boston Scotts, the Josh Perkins. That's his best coaching job. And very few people see it because they take things in a vacuum, and they're always going to say, well, the guy won a Super Bowl. That's his best coaching job. No, if you have talent, the expectations change. If you don't have talent, that's the definition of coaching. The definition of coaching is getting the most out of what you have. And I think Doug did a better job of that last year than any other year he's been here.
Well, John, you mentioned Doug Peterson and this being his best head coaching job. Where would you put Carson Wentz on that list of people that led the team, and how much credit do you think he should actually get for a run like that?
No, I think it's always a combination of everybody mixed in. And you also have to add the competition. The competition was also terrible. It's fair to point that out. I mean, if the schedule unfolded in a different way and the NFC East was better and there were better teams on the schedule, it probably doesn't happen. Not probably, it definitely doesn't happen. So all of it is kind of put into the mix. But I think, the assumption is if you're going to roll out those players I mentioned, I'm not trying to pick on them, in an NFL game, you're not expected to have success, even against bad opponents.
Yeah.
And the Eagles, if anything, from a number standpoint, they improved offensively. Carson was a big part of that. I think there was a little bit less pressure on him. One of my biggest criticisms of Carson Wentz is rabbit ears. He's got he listens to criticism a little bit too much, and I prefer my quarterback to have that sort of alpha male. I don't care what you think mentality. I think that would serve Carson well. So I think there's still some issues from that standpoint. Philadelphia is a very, very difficult market to play in. I just mentioned it. How big it is from a media standpoint. You look at Nelson Aguilar. I mean, Nelson is a perfect example. He's too sensitive to play in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
I don't think Carson's at that point, but I think what happened during the Super Bowl season, how everyone embraced Nick Foles, understandably so, and kind of forgot the guy who got him to 12-2, the guy who got him to the number 1 seed. I think he carries that with him, and I don't think he should.
Earlier this week, Eagles general manager Howie Roseman spoke to the media in a conference call going over the past free agent plans over the last 2 weeks. How impressed were you with his answers, particularly when it comes to the wide receiver and cornerback position, in which so many people thought were the two biggest weaknesses on the team?
Well, I'm never impressed. I mean, that's not part of it. The part of it, I always say the Eagles are, and I think fairly described as one of the smartest teams in the NFL, and I agree with that. And generally, and this goes far past our most recent discussion with Howie, generally what the Eagles do, the decisions they do make sense. It doesn't mean they're going to work out, but they make sense. And I think that's been a constant, and that will continue in the future. Problem is, it's not easy to evaluate players. At the wide receiver position, he's pretty consistent. He thinks it's not as bad as people outside the building think. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't going to, he likes to use the term vacuum, which I agree with. Everything's not in a vacuum. So in other words, fans are always looking. Fans want big names. They want DeAndre Hopkins. They want Stephon Diggs. Well, they don't understand DeAndre Hopkins wants you to tear up the final 3 years of the contract. They don't understand if you do that, that sets a bad precedent. They don't understand that Stephon Diggs was a pain in the you-know-what in Minnesota and always complaining. And they don't want that around what I just described. They don't want that around Carson Wentz. And then you look forward to the draft. In this draft, by everyone in the NFL, the deepest position is wide receiver. It's probably the deepest receiver draft in at least 20 years. So he's looking at that as well as free agency. Now everybody wants Robbie Anderson, Rashad Perriman. Well, if you get a receiver in the draft, Deshaun is healthy, which admittedly is a big if, and you drafted J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, the Eagles haven't given up on him. The fans have, but they haven't. And all of a sudden, everything clicks. So let's just pretend for a second. Say the first-round pick is a star. Deshaun Jackson is healthy. J.J. starts to look like the J.J. that was at Stanford. And you even have a little bit of Greg Ward mixed in, who kind of proved himself at least a little bit. Well, where the heck is Rashad Perriman going to fit in?
Of course.
Where's Robbie Anderson going to fit in? So that's how Howie thinks about the receiver position. At corner, they knew they needed to improve at corner. They targeted Byron Jones. They've been very honest about that. They weren't able to get it done. And they shifted gears to Darius Slay, who's probably a better player. Problem is he's 29 and he had to give up draft picks. And that was difficult for the Eagles because they're coming off 2 consecutive years where they've only had 5 picks. And Howie knows they need bodies, they need to get younger. So it was very difficult for them to send 2 picks along with paying Darius Slay, but they knew they needed to improve that position dramatically.
You make a great point on the Slay trade, John. I do want to ask, particularly in the secondary, adding Darius Slay, adding Nikel Roby-Coleman, is the secondary better now than it was previously last season, even though Malcolm Jenkins is gone? And I do have a Malcolm Jenkins question later for you.
On paper, and again, this is all in March, yes, because they've never had corners like this. They've never had a Darius Slay, and never I mean the Doug Peterson, Jim Schwartz era. This is by far the best corner. Nikel Roby-Coleman has been in the past a high-level nickel corner. So I know Eagles fans kind of overrate Avonte Maddox, Gravon LeBlanc. They've played well in very limited stretches. This guy's been in the past a top-tier nickel corner. So if he can regain that form, Slay is a true number 1 corner. You can cobble together the rest, and that's by far the best cornerback group they've ever had since Jim has been here. Now, the safeties, I mean, that's a difficult one. It's a difficult question because Malcolm was so successful, but he was clearly a descending player. And the question is, they are looking at Jalen Mills as going to be, and Howie called him a positionless player and talking about the versatility. And Malcolm Jenkins, over the years, Jim has said, has played 7 different positions on his defense. And they're expecting Jalen Mills to do that at some point. Maybe not to that level, but certainly be the guy that moves all over, that chess piece that can move all over. Is he going to be able to do that nearly as well as Malcolm Jenkins? I think that's kind of a stretch. So I look at it as how much worse they are from Malcolm to Jalen versus how much better they are when you talk about Slay versus whoever. And I think they're slightly better because Slay is so much of an upgrade over what they've had at corner.
I want to move on now solely to Malcolm Jenkins. And honestly, the comparison that I always hear, particularly with Eagle fans and letting Malcolm Jenkins walk, was the Brian Dawkins case back in 2008. The Eagles basically let the leader and heart and soul of the franchise go after 12 glorious seasons with the team. Do you think there are similarities here between Malcolm Jenkins and his case here leaving Philadelphia and Brian Dawkins?
Well, everyone looks at Brian Dawkins as the Hall of Fame player he is, and I think people kind of don't remember that he was at the end of his career. Mm-hmm. And the thought in the NFL, and really all sports in general, in the cliche is it's better to give up on a player a year early than a year late. I think if people are being honest, Brian had one pretty good year in Denver, and from there it was downhill. So that is overblown, I think, as a whole. They're thinking about him in the prime of his career when he was a Hall of Fame safety and playing at that level. That's not what he was when he left. So I don't hold that against the Eagles as much as a lot of the fans do. Malcolm's a lot younger, but still at 32. And I've always said what made Malcolm great is also what hurt him, in the fact that guy never left the field.
Yeah.
I mean, he played every single snap, and by every single snap, I mean every single snap. He didn't miss one over the past 2 years. You have to go back to the Super Bowl season, and he only missed snaps then because they were resting guys late in the season because they were so far ahead. He never missed a snap. When Andrew Sendejo was cut so they can ensure a compensatory pick, Andrew, a lot of people don't realize, Andrew was the personal protector on the punt unit. It's a pretty important job. Mm-hmm. Nobody thinks about it until something bad happens. Jim wanted him, didn't want to cut him. Dave Phipp didn't want to cut him, but Howie made a difficult decision because he felt he needed that compensatory pick more. Who stepped in? Malcolm Jenkins. And he's done that over his career, stepped in, played special teams. Guy never misses a practice. The only time he did that was in voluntary work last year when he was trying to signal to the Eagles that he wanted his contract tweaked. Yeah. So the point I'm trying to make is there is a lot of tread off that tire. So you might say he's 32. For the typical 32-year-old player who plays maybe 70, 80% of the snaps, maybe misses a game here and there, certainly misses a season, this guy plays all the time. Yeah. So the Eagles are looking at that, making a difficult decision. They've already seen some fall off, and it happens quickly in this league, and that's the Eagles. That was their decision. They felt he was a descending player, and it wasn't going to get better. And it was a very difficult decision for them.
You make a great point about the cliche of the NFL and in sports in general, letting a player go a year before their prime. I want to turn the question and the response and focus here to Alshon Jeffrey, another older player on the Eagles roster, but a guy that really hasn't been healthy since he got to Philadelphia. What do you think the Eagles are going to do with Alshon Jeffrey? Are they going to cut him? Are they going to wait until he's healthy? Howie earlier this week mentioned that they need to see what he's like when he's healthy first. Is that a case where he's staying an Eagle?
I think there's a chance. I still think they want to go in a different direction. But one of the things they have a little bit of time to make that kind of decision because of not only what's going on in society as a whole. There's not really an off season, but as far as OTAs and things like that, all that's going to be pushed back, number one. Second part is he's not healthy. People kind of forget about that. So best case scenario, he would be back early in the season from the foot injury. Worst case, he might miss half the season. So Howie has said consistently the first order of business is getting him healthy. And then it's about what you get in the draft. And I just kind of formulated what ifs What if the first-round pick hits and plays well early in the season? What if Deshaun Jackson stays healthy? What if JJ starts going in the right direction? In that situation, similar to what I said about free agents, Brashad Perriman, Robbie Anderson, why do you need Alshon Jeffrey? You don't. If a lot of that doesn't happen, you might need them. And I think a lot of the off-the-field stuff, the Josina Anderson stuff, is overblown. I think people forget. In essence, if you want to default to Alshon was the guy who spoke to Josina, and by the way, there's still no proof of that. Just because Howard Eskin says it doesn't mean it's true. But my point is people forget the comments. They weren't that bad. All he said was offense is too complicated, which he's not the only one to have said that in the past. And then the second part, which doesn't make sense for a receiver, is we need to check the ball down, which makes no sense from a receiver standpoint because they always want the ball. But nonetheless, it wasn't Carson's a terrible quarterback. It wasn't Carson's a terrible person. It wasn't I can't play with Carson. It was really pretty matter-of-fact kind of stuff. So I think that part's overblown. But the Eagles' bigger concern is his play on the field when he was healthy. And we just talked about descending players. He was clearly a descending player. He never had great speed to begin with. His game was about size and his ability, back shoulders, his ability to use that big body to his advantage, and he got slower. And I don't think he's going to get faster coming off a serious foot injury. So I think the Eagles kind of know from a football standpoint, he's close to being done, and they're hoping to convince some wide receiver deficient team down the road when he gets healthy, maybe this guy can do some things. So ultimately, I think they want to get rid of him, but it has more to do with football than it has to do with quotes and anonymous stuff.
Certainly a lot of different decisions that Howie Roseman and the Philadelphia Eagles need to decide on, especially when it comes to Alshon Jeffrey. One final question for you, John, and this pertains to the Eagles offseason as a whole. What do you think is the most underrated and best signing or best move that the Eagles have made to this point?
I think, and I don't even know what day it is because we never get to leave the house anymore, but yesterday when we're taping this, so we're taping this on Thursday, Nickel Roby-Coleman. I think that's one the Eagles didn't expect to happen. Certainly didn't expect to get done. Certainly didn't expect to get done at the price that they got him at, which essentially is $1.3 million a year. So that one is kind of fell in their lap. Like Slay, to me, is the best player. If the Slay in Detroit, 3-time Pro Bowl selection, at one time was the top 5 corner in this league, if he plays up to that level, he's by far the best player they've gotten, and that includes Javon Hargrave. But as far as value, as far as adding, and almost from a surprise standpoint, getting a guy you didn't think that would be in the mix, I think Roby-Coleman is the most interesting to me because now you have, again, on paper, you have a top-tier cornerback one, so to speak, in Darius Slay, and you have a top-tier nickelback. And you still got to figure out the other side, but when you got two guys who can play at the level those two guys can play, you can get a mediocre guy on the other side and still do pretty well. So the value of that signing, I think, is tremendous.
He's John McMullen, Eagles insider for 97.3 ESPN in South Jersey. John, thanks so much for your time.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it.
And again, a big thank you to John McMullen, Eagles insider for 97.3 ESPN in South Jersey. Again, welcome inside the Birds in Focus podcast, where the Birds, the Philadelphia Eagles, are the focus, as well as talking about the top storylines of the NFL. I'm Nick Faria. We talked about the NFL and our big main focus for the NFL being the running backs and the de-evaluation of the running back position. We also had our interview, but now it's time to talk about those beloved Philadelphia Eagles. And it was a busy week for the team, bringing in Nikel Roby-Coleman. Howie Roseman talked for the first time since free agency started, talking about the Darius Slay trade and other moves that the team had made to that point. And a lot of things that were interesting about that press conference. And I think the main one, and it's the reason why this show is titled Skill Position Woes, is because of his answer when it came to talking about the wide receiver position. And in Howie Roseman's mind, and he was quoted on this on Thursday, saying that the wide receiver position, the Philadelphia Eagles view their receiving corps differently than everyone else around the league, which I found interesting and also quite psychotic. Now, I'm going to sit here and talk to Eagle fans for a minute. Tell me the difference in value with a statement of we value our receivers differently than others around the league. Tell me what difference is there between that and Carson Walsh, the now fired Eagles receiver coach, saying that Mac Hollins grades well during football games because he lines up right. There really is no comparison to me. It's pretty much saying the same exact stuff. We think our receiver production is okay, and we think it's a lot better than what others around the league will say. The numbers don't lie. Last year, this receiving corps was one of the worst in the NFL, if not the worst. Nelson Agholor had 4 drop passes in game-tying or game-winning plays. The drop against Atlanta, the drop and fumble against Detroit, the drop against New England. These plays happened. These plays that Nelson Agholor did not make, these routine plays that he did not make, change the outcome of football games. Let's say he completes that pass, catches the pass against Atlanta, and runs in for a touchdown. There was nobody near him. Let's say he runs in for a touchdown. Now this team is 10-6. His mindset is completely different, being the savior of one of the earlier games of the season, and he's playing pretty well. Does he make the catch against New England? I think he'd be able to. So let's put that up there. They tie New England. Let's say they win that game. That team's now 11-5, looking at the 3 seed instead of the 4 seed playing Seattle. That's a different outlook for the team. And I'm not saying they beat a 3 seed because I know New Orleans was there and I know they were 13-3. But the outcome of that team changes because of the drop passes. And there are way too many to count. J.J. Arcega-Whiteside was horrendous in his rookie season. A game-winning drop against Detroit happened in the final seconds on 4th and 15. We look at Alshon Jeffrey. I'm going to get to him in just a little bit. His just demise and his inability to make winning plays. And one of the games that I look at showing that Alshon Jeffrey isn't the same player was against Green Bay. Now, I know he was dealing with injuries, and I know he had and was hampered by other injuries. But if you look at the game against Green Bay, what was Alshon Jeffrey's main focus as a wide receiver? He's not the best route runner. He's not the fastest, but he's a big body guy that will go up, jump ball catches, and make those unbelievable circus catches. Think Super Bowl 52, the touchdown catch against Eric Rowe that started one of the more improbable games in Philadelphia sports history. He leapt over that corner because he's over 6 feet. He's got great range. He's got great athleticism when it comes to high pointing the ball. But outside of that, there's really not much there. So when you lose that one skill set, it becomes very difficult to find an excuse to keep you on the field. Look at Dez Bryant. Dez Bryant, not the best route runner, not the fastest, but is a big body receiver that can go up and get jump balls. Tony Romo and him made a career off it. But the minute that couldn't happen, the minute he lost that, he hasn't found a team since. He got hurt. He wasn't able to be the same player, and he hasn't been the same. He hasn't found a team yet. Same for Alshon Jeffrey. Alshon's under contract, signed the 4-year, $52 million extension after the Super Bowl win in 2017. And I said before that it was a great as long as he stays healthy. But since he got to Philadelphia, the dude has not been healthy. And I transition this from as a purely wide receiver conversation and the woes that they brought in with Aguilar, with Whiteside, with Mac Hollins, and every other receiver that came in. But Alshon Jeffrey is the main point here. And you heard from McMullen earlier talking about what the Eagles are going to do with Alshon Jeffrey. I don't think there's any reason not to believe that he's going to be on the roster. There's no reason to keep him on this roster as a Philadelphia Eagle wide receiver. There isn't. Look at the game against Green Bay last season. Against Green Bay, he put up respectable numbers for a guy that was on one leg. And I think Eagle fans throughout the country will think that Alshon Jeffrey, when they look back on Alshon Jeffrey's career in Philadelphia, they'll revere him. He's the guy that helped bring a trophy to Philadelphia. And that's perfectly fine. That's perfectly fair. And he gutted through injuries back in 2017, back in 2018, last year specifically. But look at what he did last year against Green Bay. Put up 3 or so catches. But I look at the 2-point conversion try with Carson Wentz in the back of the end zone, jump ball against, I believe it was Desmond King. Now, Alshon Jeffrey, that's a play Jeffrey makes in his prime time and time again. That's why he's here. He's the jump ball receiver. He's the number one receiver. He's going to make those tough catches. And he didn't make it. 3, 4 times in that game, Wentz threw it up there for Jeffrey, and he couldn't come down with a tough contested catch. Now, people will say, well, he would have caught that for Nick Foles, and that's preposterous. Alshon Jeffrey is not the same player. He isn't, and honestly, he hasn't been for the last 2 years. They have a decision to make with Alshon Jeffrey. They were able to keep the extension going as of right now. They tendered his option, but as a post-June 1st cut, that's a player that the Eagles will probably release if they can't find a trade partner for. And I got to tell you, I think he's going to be traded. He has to be let go. You cannot, in good conscience. And McMullen shed some uncertainty about the middle of the season anonymous quote to Josina Anderson saying that it was Alshon. A lot of people thought it was Alshon. Many in the organization believe it was Alshon Jeffrey saying we need to check the ball down more. But McMullen brings up a good point saying no receiver in NFL history will ever be quoted saying that. It doesn't make sense. They want the ball. They want to stretch the field. Why would Alshon say something like that? I get it from that perspective. But when you look at it from just the distractions that were caused, and many people believe it's Alshon. And if the organization thinks that Alshon Jeffrey was the anonymous source, then there is no other explanation but to let him go. There really isn't. And I say this over and over again. You have receivers in this draft class that can change the complexion of your roster. And a lot of people say, receivers, especially in Philadelphia, they don't have good rookie seasons. Jeremy Maclin was okay. Deshaun Jackson had a very good rookie season, but not the top-level rookie season that many expect of a number one receiver, like an Odell Beckham, like a Julio Jones, and some of those top wide receivers in NFL history. But I'm going to stress to you here, if the Eagles take, and I do think they're going to double dip in the draft, maybe go first and second round at wide receiver, listen, that's good enough for me. KJ Hamler, Justin Jefferson, all those other guys, Denzel Mims. This is the deepest receiving core in the draft in NFL history. There hasn't been a better draft for wide receivers in league history. Think about that. If they trade up for Henry Ruggs, great. If they trade up for Jerry Jeudy or CeeDee Lamb, awesome. But if they stay packed at 21 and stay in the second round and keep both picks and pick up 2 wide receivers that are able to develop into primetime players, it's not going to matter who they get. I like Justin Jefferson. I think he could be very good. Jalen Reagor is another one who I think could be very solid in the Eagles uniform. And, of course, KJ Hamler, all Pennsylvania fans, Penn State fans, have seen him play. They know he's a baller. Pair him up with Carson Wentz, and you've got Deshaun Jackson 2.0, with Deshaun still on your team. This is a good enough roster to compete right now, but I think if they add 2 more receivers, just 2, and I mentioned specifically in the draft because I don't think they're going to sign another free agent wideout It doesn't look like they're going to when Howie Roseman spoke on Thursday. But if you look at it from that perspective, you get two receivers and you change the complexion of this entire roster. And this roster is changed because they're letting go of older talent. And I think if you're letting go of older talent, you've already let Malcolm Jenkins walk, it's only fitting that you let Alshon Jeffrey walk as well. And that's my final point for today. Again, a big thank you to everyone who tuned in to the Birds in Focus Episode 2 podcast titled Skill Position Woes. Can the Eagles figure out their problems at wide receiver and corner? It looks like they did at corner, but now the only position left on the need list is at wide receiver. Hopefully, we're able to see some answers solved later on in the draft and in free agency. Well, big thank you to everyone that was able to tune in, and a big thank you again to John McMullen of ESPN, the Eagles insider for 97.3 ESPN in South Jersey. We'll see you next Sunday for episode 3. Hope to have a great guest then, and I'll give you some details later on in the week for that. But anyways, thank you for listening. Have a great day and a better tomorrow.
The views and opinions expressed on today's show are not reflective of the Philly Sports Network. Thanks for listening to the Birds in Focus podcast.